get started for, in mind of time. Welcome to our first ever conservation easement and farm succession planning workshop, breakfast, event, whatever we wanted to call it. We gave it all those names. You probably noticed it changing as we sent you separate emails. But it wasn't so much a workshop, it wasn't so much an event, so we figured we'd just call it that. My name is Christian Herney, and I'm the Land Conservation Manager for Orange County. Jessica Perrin with the Soil and Water Conservation District of Orange County was anticipating being here and doing this introduction, but of course things happen, especially with those with young children, and she is under the weather today, and so she won't be able to attend. So you're stuck with me for the entirety of the 8:45 to 10 o'clock window. I know, it's rough. But I do tend to talk fast, so odds are there'll be more time than anticipated for questions in the end. I try to practice and get my presentations on time, but then I start zooming through it. So, and because of that, that's perfect for a little bit of extra time at the questions at the end. But the reason we put this meeting on was because Jessica and Cooperative Extension and a few other folks had coordinated on a farm succession planning workshop back in December, which some of you may have attended. And in that meeting, a bunch of questions came up about conservation easements and how they affect farm succession planning. And so we decided to pair up and create another meeting. And here we are to discuss both conservation easements and then bring in another law firm and attorneys from that law firm to discuss farm succession planning, because I am very much a layperson when it comes to that side of things. My work is very specific in the conservation easement portion of farm planning, and so I'll be doing the conservation easement portion, and then Jason Spain with Kennon Craver Law Firm, is that the right way to put it? Kennon Craver Law Firm out of Durham will be up here to discuss and answer questions about farm succession planning. Okay? So hopefully everybody has had a chance to get some refreshments. If not, make sure to get back there and get those. And we would like to thank the North Carolina Foundation of Soil and Water Conservation for sponsoring this meeting and allowing us to have the funding to get some refreshments for everybody. I know morning meetings can be a little rough if you didn't have a chance to eat breakfast on the way out the door. And I know a lot of you had to get out and do some work on the grounds and on the farm before you came here. So you might have even had breakfast but worked it off in that lovely weather that we've been having for the last couple of days. I know it sure does get to me after a little while. I think I've mentioned everybody that I wanted to mention in the beginning, and I will at the very end of our presentation and discussion be introducing several resource professionals. We've got representatives from the North Carolina Forest Service, from the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, from the tax office, of course, some attorneys present, myself, Soil and Water Conservation District, Cooperative Extension Office. I just can keep mentioning all these government and non-government representatives that we have here today. But in the terms of farm succession planning, and as a former Forest Service representative myself, I know it's always good to have somebody from everywhere, because every single farm has all of these aspects, and every piece of land has all of these different goals, and it's good to have those resource professionals around to be able to answer those questions at the end of a meeting such as this. So without much further ado, I didn't want to get started too early just in case we got some folks coming in. I wanted to ask just one quick question before we get into my presentation. Is there anything very specific that anybody was expecting to pull from today? And I'll try to touch on it in mine or address it at the end. I mean, you can just throw a hand up and I'd be happy to.
Just basically how we can combine the easements with other things to protect the land or use it in a variety of ways. Not just farming, but
yeah. Oh yeah, this is definitely not just for farmers. This is kind of all encompassing. It's just farm succession planning was the main goal of a lot of folks' attention at that workshop in the fall.
Just, now more people are diversifying.
Right, of course. Yep, understand. Anything else? I mean, I think that's great, because I think the large portion of this meeting is meant to address that. So
I don't know if it's you or these gentlemen, but the perpetuation or the protection beyond your lifetime, the enforcement, I guess is what I'm saying.
Sure.
After you're gone and people change their minds or other people put in petitions to the county to do something that you didn't want.
Copy that. I will definitely try to address that.
With respect to forestry land, Orange County had problems getting agencies interested in conservation easements that are up in the high and dry on the between the watersheds.
Got
You
it.
know, because it's not technically protecting watershed
Yep.
and running rivers and stuff.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, yeah. Traditionally, more of the
any
conservation
changes
protection
and
is
stuff like that
water.
here in the last 20 years.
Yep, that makes total sense, and I do have, and I wouldn't say exciting, because all the stuff that I deal with is more legal than anything, but I do have some good news about that as well.
How is this the same or different than the TLC conservatory?
Yep, great. Have a slide on that. See, I'm really excited, actually. I tried to cover everything when I was putting my presentation together, and I'm sure Jason as well. But it's good to have kind of that precursor. I kind of like having the questions in the beginning sometimes, because then as I go through, I can remember, oh, somebody actually had a question about that. All right, one more? Yep.
So, kind of like a basic you can and can't do, because, the interest for the conservation easement is there, but then thinking about it, we don't have a farm succession plan, but we do have, for our future generations, their kids, they may or may not know what they want to do with the land, if they even want to live on it later, so just in terms of not a commercial development, but just a small residential development for, maybe one or two families.
Did you keep a line on yours? All right. Well, I'm glad to get that thought and those thoughts going into this before I started my presentation. And I really am going to try to not live behind the podium here. You can tell I'm very expressive, and I'll end up knocking things off the table as I do it. But of course, I didn't get anything set up with this proper clicker, so I'm going to, if I carry the mouse around, I end up dropping it and breaking it. It's just the kind of person I am. But I will come out and chat with you as I can. So, first and foremost, reintroduce myself. I'm Christian Herney, Land Conservation Manager, and with that position, I am the manager of the Lands Legacy Program. You may have heard that before if you had attended Ag Summits in the past, or any other presentation or BOCC meeting where you've heard mention of the Lands Legacy Program. The Lands Legacy Program was the county's, I guess, keystone initial program to acquire parklands and conservation easements within the county. It's our conservation program. And initially, it was dual-faceted, formed to be able to acquire future park and preserve lands for Orange County, and then also including a conservation easement acquisition program. And so it's got two pots, so to say, and the conservation easement program is what I'm going to be discussing today. So the primary purpose of the Lands Legacy Program is to protect high priority natural and cultural resource lands. That is a very wide paintbrush mention to say important lands that have either natural or cultural value. Farm land being one of the top cultural resource values that the county has under the goals of the Lands Legacy Program. The Lands Legacy Program is entirely voluntary. And that's not saying that I'm volunteering my time to manage it, but it's entirely voluntary in its participants and its landowners that choose to be a part of it. And so I don't do much cold calling or mailers. A lot of our interest comes in just as you're doing today, through meetings, through simple phone calls, people asking questions. And a bunch of the interest in the county program actually comes, as you kind of mentioned, folks approach somebody like Triangle Land Conservancy or Eno River Association, and those land conservancies contact me and say, hey, we've got a large landowner, they'd like to, they have interest in conservation easement, but we're gonna need help. And so that's the second goal, overarching goal of the Lands Legacy Program, is to form partnerships with other government entities, municipalities, but primarily private nonprofit land conservancies. So I would say just right in between a third to half of the conservation easements that the county owns, we actually either co-own or are third-party owners of a conservation easement on lands owned or co-owned in easement form with Triangle Land Conservancy or Eno River Association. And with other municipalities, we have conservation easements on lands that are owned and managed as parks by Chapel Hill, Carborough, Hillsborough, and the like. And so the partnerships is a big portion of the Lands Legacy Program in my job, is just keeping those partnerships going. Lands that we target for conservation, both for parkland, but in this terms of this conversation for conservation easements, and these are set forth in a 3-year Lands Legacy Action Plan. We just had a Lands Legacy Action Plan approved by the Board of County Commissioners last year for the next 3 years, so up to 2027. And we use our local advisory boards, the Commission for the Environment, the Ag Preservation Board, the Historical Preservation Board, or Commission. Always get those mixed up, which ones are commissions, boards, and the like, to set these goals every 3 years. And these are not only the goals set for the next 3 years, but they're actually listed in the terms of priority. I wouldn't say that one holds higher priority than the other, but this is the priority and how many times it was mentioned by each individual board and commission. So wildlife habitat and corridors is a big one. That was mentioned by almost all 4 boards. Prime farmland and forest land was mentioned by all 4 boards. And so even the Commission for the Environment, Ag Preservation Board, the Culture Preservation Board, prime farmland and forest land has been a top priority for the Lands Legacy Program since it came to fruition back in 2000. Riparian buffers, as the gentleman mentioned up here, that's always a high priority to protect the buffers of our streams and creeks, but also our riparian areas, the isolated wetlands and disconnected ponds and wetlands that exist not only along our stream corridors, but on farmland as well. Natural areas, so, a lot of folks say, well, you already mentioned wildlife habitat and corridors, but Orange County is home to quite a few state inventoried natural heritage areas, very unique ecotypes, specifically forest ecotypes. So you think of Occoneechee Mountain and how Occoneechee Mountain is covered with chestnut oak. The next closest large stands of chestnut oak outside of Orange County are in Hickory. And so you gotta think, that's a pretty unique ecotype, and it is. There's very few occurrences of large stands of chestnut oak outside of Orange County, and yet Orange County houses 3 large stands of chestnut oak on Occoneechee Mountain, Pickard's Mountain, which is just south of Dairyland Road, and then also back up here towards Efland. Large stands of chestnut oak on these large former mountain ridges. So natural areas are very important. And then, of course, historic and cultural assets. We're talking historic buildings, areas designated as national historic structures and lands, such as Moorfields, the Moorfields property, which we actually placed an easement on Moorfields last year in partnership with Eno River Association. And a lot of historic churches, cemeteries, and lands that just need that extra protection under some sort of record of deed, like a conservation easement. So how do we get started? Well, you're getting started right now. I would say 99% of the easements that I start or initiate, they start with a phone call, and then a visit to my office, a visit to a landowner's coffee table, breakfast table, or workshops such as this. But since we haven't done this many workshops, other than the Ag Summit, this is an excellent opportunity because of all the easements that are initiated through me, they all start just like this, with about an hour-long conversation about what an easement is, what the repercussions are, how do we set goals and initiatives through that easement, and it starts just like this, in a meeting with a landowner. And so that's part of that entirely voluntary process of the Lands Legacy Program. There are 2 types of conservation easements. I don't always like broad brush descriptions of conservation easements because every single one is unique. I have not yet closed an easement that is anything like the one, the one that we closed before. But in reality, conservation easements protect two types of properties. We have what we call forever wild easements, which I guess a lot of people have had that mentality of this is the kind of easement that the county and the land conservancies are primarily interested in. Forever wild easements are leave it as it is. Low impact recreation, hunting, fishing, and walking trails, and that's it. You know, it's a natural heritage area, it's a stream buffer, we don't want much effect of the land. Leave it as it is. And then farmland and working lands easements. Now this is even more of a broad brush because it covers a lot of different categories of what can be considered farm or working lands. But I will let you know, when it comes to the county's easement holdings, 75% are actually in the second category. You know, we only have, we've got a total of 45 conservation easements, and 36 of them are farmland and working lands easements. And when you look at the goals of the Lands Legacy Program and the Lands Legacy Action Plan, you can see it's pretty clear why. That is the primary interest of many of our landowners here in Orange County. And so farmland and working lands easements are the two main categories of easements and how and what they're protecting. And I'll talk about what an easement is first. And so, give you just an example. And I try to change this example in every meeting. If anybody's ever driven up St. Mary's Road, you may have seen a sign for Holden Roberts Farm. Nels and Nancy Anderson own Holden Roberts Farm right there at Holden Roberts Road. And it's a farmland easement and a local historical landmark. The old farmhouse and many of the farm implements that are on that property and farm infrastructure are actually designated as a historical landmark. We hold this easement in partnership with the Eno River Association, and this is one of those dual-faceted easements. The bulk of the farm is held under a working lands easement, but with funding through the City of Raleigh's water program, we also have a forever wild easement that protects a much larger corridor along, I believe it's the little tributary to the Little River, flows through the northern portion of that farm, and there's a 100-foot minimum buffer protected easement along that as well, held by the state of North Carolina and the City of Raleigh. And so it's got both a working lands easement and a forever wild easement on one piece of property, which these gentlemen helped close. Well, Brian helped close. I think it was right after I started back in 2020. I've been here since about 2019. And then a forever wild easement, I used another, I guess, relevant example. So this is the Lick Creek Conservation Area, which is a conservation easement held on the south side of Car Store Road. It's actually the southern half of Jane Gledhill's farm there, the Wind Hill farm there in northern Orange County. And so the northern portion of her farm, Jeff and Jane Gledhill's, former Jeff Gledhill farm, is conserved under a working lands easement. And the southern portion, which has another section of the Eno River flowing through it, or a tributary to the North Fork of the Eno River, is protected under a forever wild easement. There are some provisions in it for a future cabin and such, and we can discuss those provisions as we go through this meeting. But largely the property is conserved under a no-touch. You know, little things are allowed on the property, but by and large, this area will be observed as forever wild. So what is a conservation easement? What is an easement? It's actually a deed of record. It is a conservation deed that is recorded with your warranty deed, with your ownership, right? And so it's recorded at the Land Records Office, and it's a permanent deed of record. And there are different ways to explain this. Jason will maybe talk a little bit about how it works under farm succession planning better than I can. But the way deed of records work is there's your ownership deed, your warranty deed. This is the deed that says that you own this land. And that is the deed that is recorded. It has the stationary power, right? Your mortgage can be in there if you have a mortgage. And that's something I'm not gonna get too deep into. But a conservation deed is recorded right with that, right on top of it. And so you still own your land. The conservation easement kind of restricts what you can do with it. And I'll talk a bit more about that as we move on. But the deed of record with the conservation easement recorded right there with your ownership deed. And it places allowances and restrictions on what can be done with that land. And in perpetuity, which I don't mention here, but I do later in the presentation. And perpetuity is just a fancy legal term for forever. All right, so an easement is recorded and is enforceable forever. There can be and is provisions in an easement for alterations of that term forever, but, and I'll touch on that in the question and answers portion at the end, because I didn't make it a part of my presentation. Let's just say canceling an easement is not impossible. It's highly improbable. It's not something that can be easily done. But for the purposes of the presentation today, I wanted to make sure I mentioned it is a deed of record, is recorded with your ownership deed, and it is in perpetuity. The two major restrictions that come under easement language are subdivision and residential development. Does that mean that there's no chance for subdivision or residential development? No, but the very first two paragraphs under the section that I guess you could call restrictions, it's subdivision and residential development, and any allowances for further subdivision or development on the property will be within those first two paragraphs. So basically say no subdivision is allowed except, no further residential development is allowed except. And that's where the uniqueness of each conservation easement comes into play. That's where you build in what you want to be able to do with your land, what you want your successors or assigns, people that you sell the property to potentially, to be able to do with that land from that moment until forever. Okay? There are many options for agricultural use. When we mention farmland and working lands easements, it's better, I think, for me to use the term working lands, because are we doing the same farming that they were doing 100 years ago? No. I mean, some of it, sure. But have things changed over time? Has technology changed? The way that we do that, the way that we farm and till or not till, or the way that chickens were housed before the same as they were 100 years ago? No, things change. So working lands is a better term. Also, and you mentioned forestry. Most of the time back 30, 40 years ago, forestry management wasn't really considered or included in a lot of the language of conservation easements. It is now, and usually just in terms of requiring a forest management plan written by a consulting forester or the North Carolina Forest Service. But forest is forestry farming? I mean, many of them have a big old sign on it that say tree farm. Sure. It's just long-term farming. We're considering it farming over the period of 30 to 50 years instead of every single summer. And so a lot of working lands easements incorporate allowances for farming and forestry and alternative farming, different forms of horticulture, animal husbandry, lots of different paragraphs listed after these two first for options for agricultural use. And I think this is a good moment to mention that most of the easement language allows for things to change. And so if you, your successors, or your assigns say, I'm done with row crops, I just want to plant trees. Under the easement language, totally allowed. And vice versa. It's like, all right, the pines come to maturity, we're gonna cut it. And once we cut it, we're going to bring out the root rakes and we're going to convert it into pasture land, and we're getting cows or llamas or giraffes or something. Who knows, 30 years from now, what will be eaten. But a lot of easement language, and I say a lot, as in 99% of it, conversion to other uses, completely allowed. Where things get a little bit more restrictive is including and expanding infrastructure. And so in a lot of farm operations, the easement language is very restrictive in, all right, so we're gonna cut down the pines, bring in the root rakes, flatten everything, and put 12 chicken houses out there. Well, now you're altering the landscape. You're doing something very different. And so if you want to leave the opportunity to change something to include more infrastructure, water, sewer, grading and paving, then we come into the conversation about farmstead areas. And I put residential areas too there because that's another conversation that should be included here. But farmstead areas, and I have pictures of this later in the presentation, farmstead areas are specific areas delineated within an easement document and on the plat that allow for infrastructure improvement, either maintenance of existing infrastructure or additional infrastructure, barns, chicken houses, grain silos, everything that you need to manage the farm either as you are or as you anticipate doing in the future. And many of these conversations come up early in conservation easement discussions when family members are already involved. And kind of that's almost a lead-in. It's not a lead-in, but it's almost a lead-in into what the Kennon Craver folks will be talking about, farm succession planning. I've had initial meetings with landowners whose heirs are sitting right there like, tell you what, I don't want to deal with cows, but I like goats. Or I'm done with tobacco, but I want to have cows. And that's a fantastic conversation to be having in the first few discussions you have, because it's like, okay, right now, farm set up, you got a large pole barn and loading area for cows. Maybe you want to expand that in the future for whatever animals or future animal husbandry stuff that you'd like to incorporate here. And that way you can work that into what is called a farmstead area.
Can I just ask a quick question?
Sure.
And this may be obvious, so what about government encroachment? Does easements protect us from government saying that they want to put a highway through?
I will talk a little bit more about that during the Q&A section. Yes, and a little bit of no. You know, the place where, I will say now, the only place where we've ever seen, and I say we as the grand or the royal conservation community, and it is typically mentioned in easement language. So if your farm's right next to an interstate highway, and there's any form of plans in that interstate highway plan to widen, that's pretty much the only way that I have ever, and I've even checked with some of we've got partners here from Mina River, I'll introduce them at the end. I've researched and talked with many other conservation community folks, and the only place we can ever find where that's actually happened has been interstate highway plans. And I even said, well, what about just state highways where they want to like widen the shoulder? The easement has actually beat that. So I was like, oh, there's just 10 more feet and an extra 10 feet of culvert. No. But interstates, you know, the DOT being as it is sometimes, it can be a bit more difficult to fight back. But I will say, in a sense, the one place that we could find where the interstate and condemnation actually pulled through, it still took them 36 months to do it. It was that hard to get the easement language. You know, they had to amend the easement, and it took 3 years for the DOT to work things out. I mentioned residential areas, and I'll have this later on. Residential areas are just as it sounds. These are areas designated around existing and or future homes, and have additional allowances for septic, wells, repair areas, and a future home, and or existing home. Because if you put a residential area around your existing home, it's still held under the easement to where it basically restricts whatever can happen within that residential area. there will be needs for including things like a repair area for your septic field. In case you've never heard that term, I know most everybody here has probably heard repair area as a term yet. So farmstead and residential areas. I've mentioned Holden Roberts, so I wanted to use them as the example, and you can kind of see how things get complicated real quick from initial map to plat. But you see here, and it's, you know, if you have to look up at the screens up there, the map on the left is actually the exhibit map. That's the map that's recorded with the conservation easement. It makes it a lot easier, not only for, you know, regular folks, but even for folks like myself, to be able to actually see where these areas are designated in comparison to the farm and the infrastructure that exists within the farm. But you can see there, farmstead area is pretty clearly delineated on both maps. It just gets a little busy on the plat map. You know, only really planners and engineers and people might stare at plat maps and know exactly what we're talking about. I'm much more of a color map person. But you can see the farmstead area is not only designated around their homes, but all of the farm infrastructure, including the ability to move and alter the road. Nels has a little sawmill down there on the southeast portion of his farm, incorporated that into the farmstead area, and the barns and all of the infrastructure the farm needs to operate. Barns, the loading dock for the cattle that they used to have on the site, all incorporated into the farmstead area. And then even within the farmstead area, you can see the areas delineated around their and their daughters' homes, recognized as residential areas. It was even more important around where the daughter's living, because that's designated as a historical structure and building. And so there were some provisions included in there to make sure that that was not only recognized, but that there were some restrictions to maintain it as a historic structure. And then you can also see that extra 100-foot riparian buffer that's actually held in another easement under the same language as the initial easement on that fork of creek that flows directly into Little River. That's at a moment. Into Little River. So those areas designed, as I mentioned, these areas designated and delineated for construction and infrastructure support. So construction is allowed, even potentially residential areas, but largely construction and improvement of the infrastructure for the purposes of managing that farm.
Am I correct that 100-foot is actually 100-foot on each side of the stream, and so it's almost 200 or a little more than 200 depending on how it's calculated?
Correct. Yes, you are very correct. You can see it's 100-foot on each side. And so it is actually a 200-foot buffer on that stream. And if it's a primary stream, or beyond a primary, so like Land and Water Fund or City of Raleigh, if it's Eno River or the actual Little River, they'll ask for 300 feet on each side. So it'll be a 600-foot buffer. Not necessarily where we would go, but that's what they would ask for. Now, we mentioned farmstead areas, but I'm specifically bringing this one up for residential areas. So we go back here, and I mentioned these residential areas around the home. So everything that you would ever need to incorporate into your residential area language, future repair areas, wells, potential for an accessory dwelling unit, as in somewhere either where you do art, man cave, future living quarters for mom, you know, all of those things would need to be incorporated into a residential area. Driveway relocation, all these sort of things are mentioned for the purpose of preserving the land and conserving the land as it is. But if you don't want to deal with that, or I even mentioned this, a lot of our grant funds, because all easements have to be funded by the county, and I'm expected to receive match from either the state or federal governments or other grant sources. A lot of the grant sources have come to the point where they're like, if you have any plans for a future home, or if you want to pass this land down and give your children the opportunity to build a home, they're preferring you just go ahead and cut that portion out. It's because when you do want to build a home or change your septic area, move your driveway, not only do I and county legal, not only does the county have to review it and approve it, then I have to send everything up to the state or the federal government to review and approve. And anybody who's dealt with just the planning and permitting process in Orange County and North Carolina knows how long that process takes. Add on to that how long it's going to take me and the legal team to review and approve it. Add on to that how long it's going to take the state to review and approve it. What normally takes already too long, 3 months, is now stretched out to 6 to 9 months or longer. And so a lot of folks, usually under some nudging by myself or my private nonprofit cooperators, we say, if there's a potential home site you want to leave out, let's just cut it out of the easement. Now, I'm not saying that's what Kim and Chad elected to do here. I just have this as a good example. You can see the red line is the conservation easement. You can see the farmstead areas, and you can see that chunk there that has direct road frontage to Pearson. That's just cut out. And that leaves the woods the opportunity to just worry about the planning department with anything that they would like to do with that chunk. They do actually have a farmstead area set up along Pearson Road as well for future farm infrastructure. But the area around their home and the acreage all the way to Pearson is not bound by any of the terms of the conservation easement. And so if they want to do anything there, they don't have to call me first. They go straight to the planning department. And I and the state of North Carolina, because this is actually held by 2 different Department of Agriculture conservation easements, as well as the language with the Orange County. They don't have to worry about any of that. And so that's important to mention. Sometimes a residential area should just be left as a residential area, as in cut out of the easement entirely. It leaves a lot less work in the future. At first I tried to make a timeline, but no easement is ever held to a specific timeline. And I'm not gonna try to, make everyone laugh, but this is about as simple as I could put it. I made the easement process simplified, and I threw it in quotes because it made me laugh when I started making this, and I realized I was gonna need 2 or 3 slides for it. I said, no, I can compress it into 1. I can do it in just 1. I know I can. So this is the process, simplified. Initial contact. Hey, this is kind of initial contact, right? And then any conversations you have with me after this meeting or in the coming weeks, that's still part of the initial contact phase. A letter or an email from the interested landowner, I have to have kind of a formal ask from a landowner to start the process, to gain permission from the county manager to start working with you in a formal and legal way. I love handshake conversations, but handshake agreements have gone the way of Buffalo. We have to have a formal ask. Basically, it's an email that can say, I'd like to work with the county for putting a conservation easement on the land. Perfect. That's how we get things going. And then I form essentially a packet of materials, maps, a narrative, and description of the property and bring it to the county manager to review. And the county manager can approve me to not only start moving forward, but to hire an appraiser to start the process, the legal process of easement acquisition. And all the grant sources require an appraisal for us to even receive grant funds. And so that comes up. And the manager also gives me permission to start pursuing grants. And those applications, as I mentioned, just for your formal move forward, those applications require a signature on them. So I have to have the manager's approval just to sign a document. And so just to sign the application to get money to potentially put an easement on the property. And you can see there's several different grant sources. Then even once I've gotten the grant funds and appraisal and landowners on board, I have to approach the board in closed session. I have to get their approval to get an option to purchase signed by the landowner and by the county. I have to get their approval to accept funding from the grant sources that I've received application awards from. And in this, I get approval by the board to pursue the remainder of the closing documents. I did not list them all here. I just listed the most simple ones, the major ones, the ones that are actually recorded. The survey, phase 1 environmental review, where we hire somebody to come out and make sure that there's nothing out on the property that could be an environmental hazard. And of course, start drafting the easement itself. Most of the time, by this point in the process, we've already started drafting easement materials. But this is where I get a formal draft sent to the county attorney's office and they start reviewing it. And then go back to the board after everything is already pretty much done. Then we have a budget. We've actually formed a budget. We know exactly how much the easement and all of these documents are going to cost. And so I go back to the board to get a final budget approved and to get approval to hire a closing attorney and send everything up to the state or federal government to review and approve as well. And then even after all of that is finished and the board is okay with everything, they've reviewed all the documents, county attorney's office has reviewed everything, I still have to approach the state or federal government to get approval to close. And by doing that, I have to submit everything that already been mentioned and a settlement statement which delineates and shows all of those fundings, all those grant sources, and set up things for the funding wires and the recording. Main reason I bring all of this up, this is the simplified list. An easement takes approximately, I used to be able to say 1 to 2 years. And there is opportunity to close an easement inside of a year, but it's difficult. You can imagine, this is similar to like the planning process to getting things approved through planning, except that this is a formal recording that sits on top of your ownership deed, and so everything has to be just right. You have to approve it, the county has to approve it, our grant sources have to approve it, the attorney's office not necessarily has to approve it, but also make sure that we haven't missed anything, And so all of this, without money, and I'm being literal, even if there was no money involved, all of this takes about a year. Include money, and you've added another year. Because all of the hands in the pot have to have those approvals. And so the average conservation easement takes 2 years to close. And we've had some that are very complicated and have multiple funding sources take close to 4. I mentioned Moorfields. I'm going to show a map so you can see why it was so complicated. Moorfields, we had approval. We had award approval for the grant funds in March of 2021. We closed last May. So it took every bit of 3 years to close Moorfields. And we thought for a minute that they were going to delay us until about September, October. But we were able to push the state to finalize their approvals by May, and we were closed by the end of May.
So if I'm not seeking a county purchase or any grant funding, I still have to go through all of this to get county approval?
Correct. So if you're thinking donation, as in there's no funding necessary, all of this would still be necessary. I was kind of leaving that to the funding conversation. Donations go a lot quicker because I don't have to get grant source approval, but I do still have to get manager approval, closed session. Actually, I get to skip the closed session because donations don't have to go to closed session. Essentially, I get I get approval to get all of these other documents put together by the manager because there's no purchase involved. It's just the payment for these documents. So I only have to go straight to open session. But I did have a recent donation. Now, one was delayed because of COVID and because of development reasons. But we just closed on a conservation easement along the, I'm having a bubble, along a creek corridor on William Richmond's tree farm right off of Richmond Road. And from the moment that Mr. Richmond said, I want to have an easement to closing, still took about 11 months, just because of getting all the documents together. I mean, I don't know, who's had a survey done in the last 5 years? How long did it take? 8 months. How long did yours take?
It was a conservation easement through the River Association.
Yep.
And it took them probably 2 to 3 months for the survey, and then by the time all the other paperwork was done, another 3 months.
Yep, yeah. And that's like a survey alone, just the survey can take 3 to 6 months. Just because, you're essentially taking land that's already been surveyed and you're putting more lines through it. And in the Richmond's case, they had 2 parcels that they wanted to recombine and then put an easement across an area that had formerly been across 2 parcels. So that took a little bit longer, and then had to meet those, I won't throw anybody under the bus, but still had a 30-day review period in their land records office. And so the survey was done, but then another month added so they could review it and make sure it was kosher.
Another thing along with that survey is you may find out that part of your land has been stolen. And what I mean by that is, if you have a large piece of land that's surrounded by woods and the property line is not very delineated, when somebody else adjacent to you bought or sold that property and it was surveyed, if that surveyor surveyed it wrong,
Yep.
and you don't have any way of knowing it, and that happened to me. I had several corners that were surveyed wrong and lost small wedges, several acres of my land because of that.
Yep. And
So what I'm saying is, anybody around you that's buying or selling land, you need to check their survey after that's to make sure that your land has not been taken during that survey.
And I mean, it's well represented here, especially with that comment. That has virtually nothing to do with the easement process. But in the easement process, discrepancies come up, not only in surveying, but in title searches. All of a sudden, I mean, we've got a situation now, Century Farm. And you think it's been under same family ownership for 100 years. That's why it's a Century Farm. But how was it passed down over 100 years? Was it passed down in the purest and legalist of ways? Or was it passed down by great-grandfather wrote on a napkin, this is yours now. And that was put in the land records. But that's not legal, So there's ways land's passed down and it's discovered in the easement process, and that creates delays. And so even in the terms of a donation, you can have hitches. Wanted to touch on easement funding. I'm going to probably speed up a little bit because, I like to allow for conversation. And that's okay because I built 15 minutes in the end. Plus, I wanted to make sure, you saw it in your agendas, there's an asterisk at the bottom that I added to the agenda yesterday. We have this room until noon. So even after I close the meeting, myself and most of these resource professionals that we're introducing at the end, we're hanging out for about an hour afterwards to answer any individual questions. So just giving you that heads up. So easement fundings. A bunch of different aspects come into play, but funding is the large part of the conversation. Even in the terms of donation, because in the terms of donation, normally the county will offer to pick up the closing tab. So we'll offer to pay for the closing. And that includes paying for the survey, paying for the easement, recording fees, paying for essentially everything involved in closing, a phase 1 if necessary. And that tab can get, it can get kind of hefty, upwards of $20,000 to $30,000 just for closing a donated easement. But most of the time, the county has the funds to cover that. Or I can put in grant funds that are kind of, they expedite the closing process. They don't hold us up because they don't have to approve all the documents. They're just paying for the closing. So options of acquisition, I don't really like using the options for purchase, essentially. Those can boil down to 3 categories: purchase, bargain sale, and donation. And I'm going to touch on these, and we can talk more individually about this as you approach me either today or down the road if you have interest. Purchase of a conservation easement, just as it sounds. It's the full out and all out purchase of the easement. Bargain sale is where you donate a portion of that value. So I will touch a little bit more on that after I talk about donation. So an outright donation is just as it sounds. You're donating the value of your easement. Purchase, we're purchasing the value of the easement. Bargain sale, you are donating a portion, a percentage of that easement value. Easement value is the term that you've heard 3 times now. In easement, the value of an easement is determined by an appraisal. An easement appraisal is conducted by a certified appraiser who's also certified to conduct easement appraisals. And what an easement appraisal is, you're used to seeing a form appraisal, which is like 2 pages that shows like 3 comparables and then says this is how much your property's worth. An easement appraisal is a bit more complicated and typically runs between 30 and 40 pages. So what an easement appraisal and what an easement appraiser does is does first kind of a general appraisal, appraising your property for its highest and best value, highest and best potential value, looking at your zoning, looking at soils, looking at local schools, roads, infrastructure, all of the normal facets, but they include every single one of those facets in their easement appraisal. So that's where all those extra papers start coming from, because they're actually legally required to tell you why they included that value in their appraisal. So they do all of the standard appraisal and list and narrate why your easement or your property is worth this much. And then they do a second appraisal, and the second appraisal is you can't do any of that. That's because that's what an easement does. It restricts your subdivision and further property development rights. So first they're going to do an appraisal, much as a standard form appraisal, with a description of why this is the highest and best value of your land. Probably use about 10 to 12 comparables as opposed to just 3. And then they're going to take another appraisal value as if you couldn't do any of those things. And the difference of those 2 values, highest and best use, and you can't do any of that, the difference between those 2 values, that's your easement value. That's how much the conservation easement is worth. Generally, and I am not a certified appraiser, but generally, easement value comes in somewhere between 40 and 60% of the total value of your land. Usually you get higher easement values the closer you are to towns, to schools, to any kind of supportive infrastructure, especially sewer and water. Those will raise your property values up real high. And if you're restricting development in an area that has, we'll use Mebane as an example. If you're within Mebane's ETJ and on the road where you would have access to sewer and water, your easement value is going to be huge, because they would be able to part and parcel your land into 1/4-acre lots and stack as many homes on that property as possible. And if you take that away, the ability to do that, that's worth a lot. So you probably have an easement value that's 70% of your land value. But get up into Cedar Grove, where I live up right off of Walnut Grove Church Road. No access to sewer and water. The soils don't perk. There's streams going every which way that require 60 to 80 foot buffers. You start your parcel of your opportunities for subdivision go from 1/4-acre lots to 10-acre lots. I'm sure some of y'all know exactly what I'm talking about. Then the easement value goes a little bit lower, gets down to about 40% of the value of the land. because you're limited in what you could do in standard development anyway, so the easement value is not gonna affect it as much. Still 40% of your land value, but not as high as Mebane ETJ. And I mentioned the grant process and timeline. We have a bunch of different grant sources, and 99% of them have grant application dates, usually at the very end or the very beginning of the year, December, January, February. And so if you were to approach me like right now and say, I want to do an easement and I want it to be funded, I want you to pay me for it, then I have to approach grant sources. By county policy, I have to try to get a match in grant fund, or in easement funds. And in doing so, I have to apply for those grants. And if the grant doesn't close, if the grant application date's in December, we can talk all day from now until December, but I'm not gonna put the application in until that date. And then they usually have about a 6 to 8 month review window, and they give awards in September. And so you started the conversation with me in June. We applied for the grant in December, and I don't even know if I have funding to fund your easement until September. So almost a whole year has passed before I can even start moving forward with grant funds. That's why donations usually go a lot quicker. Now, I do have a new grant fund that we have been awarded specifically for farm and working lands called the Ag Growth Zone Grant. And it is designed to expedite that process. There is no application window, and guess who the grant manager is? It's me. And so I have a grant fund that I can use for farmland and working lands easements that I'm actually the primary reviewer who decides whether or not it meets the qualifications of the application, and then I just send it to the state and they look through and say, yeah, he's right. And it's supposed to wrap that process up. The goal of that fund is to be able to close easements 1 year after grant award. And since there's no application closing date, they're expecting a 1 to 3 month turnaround reviewing my application and saying that I am correct, that it qualifies, and then moving through the process. So there is opportunities for grant-funded, county-funded conservation easements to move forward at a much faster rate. But I would still expect, because of that, I would still expect 1.5 years for those to close. So I made mention here, project timeline, 1 to 2 years. And I say that because that's what I've said for the last 5 years, and now I'm starting to come into reality, but I'm still in denial of it. That things can close faster. I know they can close faster. I just have to pull the fingernails out of the state folks. You know, come on. Purchase or donation, these take time. Grant process is about 2 to 3 years. Ag Growth Zone grant is supposed to be bringing things back to the 1 to 2 year window. I emphasize the need for family buy-in. I have had 2 situations now. I've had about 10 easements closed in the last 6 years. I've had 2 of which we are almost to the end, and a future heir comes into play. What about my future home? Well, you said you never wanted to move back here. Changed my mind. Land's really expensive. Okay. Now we have to change the survey. 3 more months. You know, and it's like, it can be done. We can amend things before it closes. But I emphasize this need for family buy-in. We can amend things before it closes. It takes a few months to amend surveys, easement language, and everything before it closes. Even though easements allow for amendments, after it's recorded, amendments to an easement to allow for something that wasn't allowed in the original, I mentioned canceling is very difficult. This isn't as difficult, but it can be. Any amendments after the easement closes has to meet or exceed the conservation goals of the original easement language, even if it's only a month or 2 after that easement closed. closes. And so that means if your easement said no more than one residential area allowed to be on the property, and now you want two, if I get state or federal funding, we'll go back to that cut it out portion. If we receive state or federal funding, I can tell you, adding a home to an easement that wasn't previously allowed, they won't do it. They won't let me do it. It'll be the fastest conversation I get to have on the phone ever. Oh, you want to add a home? No. It's that blunt. And even if there's provisions in the easement that allow it, I use Van Bennett and Bernadette Policier's farm up north. You know, right behind the Blueberry Farm, Botanist and Barrel area. They had specific easement language that allowed for them to not only move the residential area, but build upon it. Just getting approval and getting the legal language right to move that residential area and allow a home still took 14 months for something that was allowed within the easement language. But I had to get a survey done. I had to create new exhibit maps. I had to delineate the area the home would be within. I had to recognize the area the septic field would be in. It's basically the planning process in addition to the easement process, as I already mentioned. And then add a grant source. We had an easement amendment that we had to have done down near Owasso land. So it was held by a state easement, co-held by Owasso. And the amendment, all the amendment did was allow for a walking trail. That's all it did. The state took 18 months to approve it. A walking trail. Not a home, not a septic field, not a well. A natural surface, 3-foot wide walking trail along Turkey Hill Creek. That was it. 18 months for the state to approve it. So, full family buy-in. Know what you want to do with the property, and that way we can structure the easement language to allow for that. And you'd be surprised what I can get the state to approve before the easement closes. After the fact, very difficult. And I will always, and our partners, will always provide all of these materials for your review before the closing. We want you to see it all. We want you to understand every little facet. And I catch a lot of flack from our board and from upper echelon, because I will leave portions of the easement highlighted and bolded throughout the entire process, and then I'll go to submit it to them. They're like, "Why is this highlighted?" I'm like, "Oh, sorry, let me unhighlight that." And the answer is because I wanted the landowners to read that part over and over and over again, to know why it was labeled that way. So kind of towards the end here, they can all be custom tailored. I kind of scared you, I think, a little bit with all of these cautionary notes, but every single conservation easement, even with state and federal funding, can be custom tailored to meet your goals and objectives. Multiple goals and objectives. We can incorporate natural resource protections, working lands, cultural sites. All of these things can be not only mentioned, but realized in the easement language and the surveys. We have easements that go across multiple stakeholders. You know, I mentioned the Holden Roberts farm, you know, with the state holding an easement along the creek, and then the county co-holding the easement with Eno River Association along the farmlands. And it's just, it needs to be mentioned that these can be custom tailored and have multiple stakeholders, different family members, future heirs and successors. They can all be realized in these easements. But just know, the more stakeholders, the longer it'll take. Not only to form the easement, but to get every single person to say, that meets my goals. That's what I wanted to say. And the outcome is that all the objectives are met. And my last couple of slides is literally showing that. This one took 3.5 years to close. This is the Moorfields easement. There's a lot of color on that map. So you can see Eno River Association in Orange County, we hold a conservation easement on everything that isn't hashed, that doesn't have the cross hatches, and that's a working lands easement. The state of North Carolina holds a conservation easement on everything that has the hatch marks on it. So that is more of your forever wild. We don't touch that. We leave that alone. That's protecting a stream corridor and a natural heritage area. Eno River Association in Orange County hold and will perpetually monitor the easement on all of it, but we're guarding the farm and farmstead areas. And then there's also a Mountains to Sea Trail corridor going across the northern bounds. The state allowed us to build a trail corridor, and now there's actually a chunk of trail that's being constructed there now that will be a future connector for the Mountains to Sea Trail to connect 7 Mile Creek Nature Preserve to Occoneechee Mountain State Natural Area. So there will be a section of trail through there. And I show you, this is the exhibit map. This is the part that was recorded with the conservation easement. That's the plat. In total, from draft to formation to state approval to redraft to state approval to redraft, that survey plat took 9 months to create. Relabels, all of. I don't envy surveyors after that one. So you can see it was very complicated. And so just the survey took 9 months. And surveys can take a long time. And that was a large reason why that easement took so long to close. So I wanted to show you that process again, after showing you that plat map, show you that process. And this is my simplified timeline. And then since it was asked, and I was glad that I had the opportunity to actually put this in there, there are alternatives to county-held working lands easements. There are wonderful private nonprofit land conservancies in these areas. We partner with them a lot. Rima in the very back corner, she's actually one of the main representatives from Eno River Association. We do work with ERA a lot when it comes to conservation easements, but also in land purchases. They can purchase land and county can be a third-party easement holder. The county can purchase land and Eno River Association can be a third-party easement holder. I'm sure Jessica would have been here and would have mentioned and had a little conversation about the VAD EVAD program, the Voluntary Ag District and the Enhanced Voluntary Ag District program. There are Soil and Water Conservation District folks here to discuss that after the meeting. You know, if you don't want to commit to a conservation easement, and dear God, if you have a farm, I hope you're already a part of the PUV program, the present use valuation. But essentially signing a promise to the county and state tax offices that you are managing the farm for agriculture or forestry, or even we have a representative from Wildlife Resources Commission that'll talk about the relatively new wildlife preservation use valuation program, even though it's not technically a PUV program. I can't say it's something else without getting confused myself.
Program.
Yep. And then, you know, I'd be remiss to not mention, you know, if you're not interested in easements, but just outright sale, not only does Orange County, but many of our private nonprofit partners have accepted lands or purchased lands under the interest of continuing to manage them as parks. Triangle Land Conservancy has several, you know, park and preserve lands. And then Eno River has an area up on the confluence that they still kind of actively manage as pasture or farm, or more like grassland. And then we have Blackwood Farm Park that we do still mow for pasture grass, you know, or grassland. And so there is opportunities for things outside of the conservation easement with the county or conservation easements, period. And we have people here that'd be able to discuss those with you. I took much longer than I thought, but that's okay. I wanted to talk slow. I'm going to give you the opportunity still to ask a couple of questions, but I will remind you, if you have any questions that you think is going to be specific to you and your situation, I'm going to be here until, I'll be here all day, but I'll especially be able to break off and talk with folks around 11 to noon.
Why would you enter into an easement what is, as a farm owner, what is the advantage to you when you're limiting the use of the property? It's very difficult to do anything different, and you're only here for a short period of time. And especially if you're handing down the property and somebody's vision is going to be so different. Why make it so difficult? I mean, I get the title of it, sounds great, but the actual infrastructure that ends up being put there or blockades put on a property, make it just really difficult and make you really dislike these programs.
You know, and I understand that. I'm not a generally flowery when I come to describe things person, but I think in your question you kind of answered it almost a little in a sense. More often than not, the folks that approach me and are determined to do it, they want that blockade. They want it to be a little difficult. The conservation, the term conservation, you know, hits with them harder than I guess with an average folk, is they want to make it to where their heirs and successors or future assigns are limited in their ability to change the land. Primarily in subdivision and development. And that, to me, is the ultimate goal, is to, you know, to restrict the opportunity for subdivision and further development. Everything else, as I mentioned, it sounds difficult, but it's only difficult in the planning, which is kind of part of the farm succession portion of this conversation. But even in sense, they want to, you know, you can go from pasture to forest. You can go from forest to row crops. You can go from row crops back to pasture. And you can even, if you build your farmstead area large enough, incorporate the opportunity for plenty of infrastructure to support virtually any form of agriculture that you might or your successors might be interested in. So the difficulty in planning, sure, but the restrictions to what kind of farming you can do, I don't want to call them loose. But if you were to tomorrow, if you had a conservation easement on your property and you say, listen, I kind of mentioned this in the beginning, you said, listen, I do not want to raise cattle anymore. I'd rather just plant the whole thing in trees and be done with it. That phone call, I will say, okay, go ahead. From that point, I would hope, and some easement language would require you to get a forest management plan, but essentially the permissions to convert from agriculture to forestry is a phone call and an email. And then as the process goes on, the requirements of the state PUV program, the requirements for grants that you would receive to be able to plant trees, they provide all of the materials that meet the terms of the easement anyway. And so it's not as restrictive as you might think to change what you're doing out there. If you wanted to clear cut and convert back to pasture or row crops, the easement really just restricts more of what you can do close to streams, you know? And so it's like, I want to clear cut. Okay, but just remember the easement says that you have to leave a minimum buffer as required by the forest practice guidelines under the state code, under the state, general statutes, which you would legally have to do anyway. But the easement just reinforces that and says that you need to follow a forest management plan, which the state requires anyway to be able to go, you know, so you get my gist here. Easements don't restrict what you can do on the land in terms of working lands and farming as much as you might think. You just need to build it into it from the outset.
Quick question, on the farmstead component of an easement, does it allow residences that have an agricultural nexus, like a farm manager, kids are moving there? The reason I ask is that in Orange County, unless things have changed recently, whether it's under an easement, if it's out not in an easement, you have the opportunity to build homes with an agricultural nexus without having to subdivide it, unless that's changed recently.
There is provisions in many working lands easement that allow for farmhand housing. It's important to realize that farmhand housing, under state law and typically under easement enforcement does not include the farmer and the farmer's family's homes. And so there can be restrictions for further homes, like, you know, you can't say, okay, grandma's house is right here, and we're gonna build my house right next door, and we're gonna call that farmhand housing. If it's gonna be a permanent residence for somebody who, you know, shares the last name, it might be a little bit harder to get that approved. But, you know, large residential area, large farmstead area, farmhand housing can be included as long as it's pretty much seasonal.
But outside of the easement, what I'm saying is like an area
Oh.
like Kim's Farm, for instance, my understanding is you can do that for anything that you can show that has a nexus to the farming operation. It's important to note that the septic needs to perk and everything within that area too. But unless that's changed, you could put 5 houses, which is not, have been able to,
Well,
you couldn't do that in the past.
Well, if it's outside of the easement, it's not bound by the terms of the easement, period.
Right, even in the past in Orange County, let's say you had no easement, you get a house and accessory dwelling unit, and that's it.
Yeah.
But that's been changed unless they've changed it back, so it's important to note.
I don't think that's changed in the easement enforcement capability.
Back to the previous question, you know, why would somebody do a land legacy program easement? So, because you don't want the land to change over time, get that, there's grant money, okay, you talked about that. Are there tax deductions or?
Yes, and one provision that one thing I will mention, period, and I don't know, you know, I don't want to take up too much of these gentlemen's time. And don't be too prepared to write things down, because I basically have to say this several times. And I have a handout that was formed by CTNC and Triangle Land Conservancy and the other private nonprofits that I'd be happy to give to you. But as I am not a certified tax official, nor a tax attorney or tax accountant, I cannot offer you any kind of tax advice. Yes, there are many opportunities for tax advantages, not only in the payment of, you know, for a conservation easement, but in the donated value, if that's something you choose to pursue. But I would highly recommend you talk to people who are certified to give you advice. The piece of paper I can hand you kind of really outlines it a little bit better, and it was drafted by attorneys, so it makes it a lot easier for me to hand that to you, and then for you to go to the links and IRS reference pages to find the opportunities and advantages to conservation easement benefits, not only in the donated value, but also in the terms of if you're currently under present use value and you place a conservation easement on your land, the difference in the taxes that you pay either, or you can remain in the present use valuation program and remain under that designation. And then if it was ever lost, the repercussions would not be anywhere near as severe. We have somebody from the tax office here. Oh, yes, who can discuss that with you. Easement value on annual taxes is much, much less than, you know, residential or
Market value.
or market value. I can't give you any advice on what that value difference would be. But yeah, easements kind of, I guess, to the advantage of your question in the back and then to this one, easements kind of provide another layer of, I hate to say it this way, tax protection in a sense. But yeah, that would be something best to be talked with a tax professional and or accountant.
So the easement, conservation easements completely restrictive, or can they be, I know you mentioned some tailoring going on, so for instance, if you wanted to put solar panels on your property, or I know what I'm hearing you say is that, you know, soil evaluations, all of those things need to be done to designate those areas prior to cutting out your easement portion, but is it anything you can put in there? Like supply lines, anything like that that can go in it, or is it completely restrictive?
I haven't been asked about solar panels before, so now you've struck my curiosity. And
You can
now
thank
that's something
Audra
I'm
for
going to
that
have to
one.
research. No, I'm gonna research that one a little bit. I would imagine. Oh, shoot, please.
Yeah, sorry, my name is Ryan Manning, I'm with Working Lands Trust, we specialize in ag easements, and to that point,
state program, solar in pursuit of the farm, production of energy for the farm would be allowed. Commercial solar fields would not be. And then I just wanted to add to the ladies in the back question, to build on what he had said. Easements aren't right for everybody. It's a very personal choice. Some people works wonderfully for, some people not. But as has been mentioned, there are substantial compensation, tax implications to your benefit. It can reduce development pressure by basically taking that out of the picture. You know, it can be part of estate planning. You know, so there's a lot to it. There's no one right answer of why it may work for some people, why it may not work for some people. And then, as has been mentioned, there's all different kinds of easements that have all different allowances and restrictions. So part of figuring out what easement is right for you is asking yourself, what do I want for this property? What do I want for this farm? And really only you can answer that.
I guess my point is that I didn't get to make that choice. My property had an easement, and I need to get approval if I want to put a bench out. And I don't know that they foresaw that. And there's, you know, I talked to them and there's like, no, sorry, this is a restrictive one.
Well, we can definitely, I don't want to cut too much more into Jason's time. But we can leave the opportunity at the end to talk about things, more specific things at the end or work things out, you know. No?
I just want to ask if you've had people looking into easements who've wanted to talk to others who already have easements, and whether that's something you put together. And if folks are interested, I work with North Carolina Farm Link, and we have a video online that you know, is about a farmer's decision on making putting his land in easement. So sometimes hearing from people who actually have done it helps people navigate those challenges.
And I know that Noah, Orange County holds conservation easements on Noah's property. Kim's still got her stuff there. Ms. Woods, you know, we hold easements. I know that there's several folks in here that are here for either part and parcel of this meeting that we can almost beg to stick behind and be able to answer any individual questions that way.
One last quick comment on solar. I totally agree that if it's a commercial solar operation, that's one thing, but there's a new thing you might want to look up called agrivoltaics, where you're doing solar and farming on the same property. And a large commercial developer, solar developer may not be interested in that, but it is still possible to do it in Europe and a number of places around the country. And Rutgers and Cornell has got some experiment if you're interested in producing solar and still being
Well, I've noticed people kind of getting up and going if they need to. Do y'all need a moment, a break, while we get Jason set up?
How are you doing? I didn't even realize I was sitting next to you.
Yeah, I'm sitting right on that tall, and to be on first thing. Yeah, I mean, that's You're welcome. I feel like
We're just trying to get off.
Yes, now have a legacy. forces.
Like go to state, like go to probably the state's. Sure. You know,
Because selfishly, it's important. Because
But you want it to be.
I but it's really
Well, totally, I mean, it'll be traditional, whether or not it's other types of much less working, it's more like space. Really good, such a small acreage. More limited.
And so that,
County bills, it's a sole problem, because they have to. Yeah, and I might, talk to, I'm always told,
in your case, it's different, but it's kind of like buyer beware. Because
some of these can be developments that are required to set aside.
But you're telling
But
me.
the HOA did not want to make it.
Well,
So they
Yeah.
And so, like, you have 30 acres development that has 7 acres of open space, and then I'm in charge of making sure that they don't do anything stupid. I hate to put it that way, but it's an HOA. And so it's like I have no problem with kids building forts, but maybe not that big parking lot that you put right on the tree, And so, and so that's
has to be good conservation. That's a lot. It has to be 20 acres. So if you have like a 20-acre lot, exactly. And you put it in
well, no, it's okay. Very similar. Much smaller. Just kind of wild situation. Since it was custom tailored, so I had to,
And so, I mean, there's that basement, that's
I have to have This is what you're willing to do. So
And he doesn't know, I'm sure. But the parts of it that are so hard for me is that why do you approve the trails there should be some type of guidelines.
This is, so you would know if you like that other example.
Yeah.
But you could
Life's this big, nothing will be, wash it out for weeks.
The biggest issue I have is if something takes too long.
I've already spent,
Well, no, not the full change. If something takes too long, I have a problem having county commissioners. Part of it is my starting. So I have one use
But I had to listen to lawyers talk about it before. So, that's my impression. Like, it's not this much, like, it's fine, but if it needs to not be an option, we don't want to, I should go with the neighbors.
I'd love to continue answering questions, but I do want to make sure that I give Jason, at least the allotted time that I originally. So if everyone could move to your seats, I promise you I will hang out after 11 and be able to answer as many questions as humanly possible. And since there's food in the back, I'll probably hang out after that. Awesome. You think you'll need this? You can either use that or my mouse. Arrow keys or. So let me introduce Jason Spain. He's an attorney with Kennon Craver Law Firm, and also his family owns a large farm.
I don't know how large it is, but yes, it's larger at one time. All right, well, good morning, everyone. As Chris said, my name is Jason Spain. I'm an attorney with Kennon Craver in Durham, and my role at the firm is I'm an estate planning attorney primarily, which means I meet with families to help them put together their estate plans. And for certain families, in addition to just basic estate planning, we'll also do what we might call succession planning. Now, succession planning is something I think of as something you talk about when a family owns an asset that is likely to outlive them. And the two biggest examples would be something like a farm or just a business generally, where this is not just something like a bank account that's going to be split up amongst the kids and they're going to go their separate ways. There's some entity, there's something here that's going to last longer than your lifetime. So that's why when you see estate planning versus succession planning, really we're kind of talking about the same thing, but estate planning applies to everyone. Succession planning may not, depending on what type of asset that you have. For the last 10 years, I've been doing primarily estate planning as really my sole occupation. So I think and talk about this stuff every day. So we're certainly not going to run through all of estate planning in 45 minutes. But if there's anything I don't cover or anything you have questions about, please let me know. I'm happy to go into whatever you're interested in. And just to give you a real brief background on me, as Chris mentioned, I do come from a farming background. My father was a tobacco farmer in Vance County for pretty much his entire career. And so my very first job was I got to work in the barns. And I got the job of helping pass the green tobacco leaves from the trailer onto the rack and then someone much bigger and stronger than me would push that rack down and load it into the barn. And I think I was maybe somewhere around 12 when I graduated to working in the field. And I thought that was great because I got like $2 an hour more. But what I didn't realize is in the field, there is no shade. In the barn, I was at least under recovering. I didn't have to walk around too much. The water cooler was right there. And my job, which again, initially I saw was a very good thing, was I was primarily the tractor driver. So I got to sit up there on that old diesel Ford tractor while everyone was priming tobacco around me. But what that meant was there was no cab, there was no air conditioning, there wasn't even a top. It was just the sun above me and that diesel engine below me. And so you had heat coming from both sides, and you just had to sit there. And so on days like today, I think about sitting in that field when I was probably 13 or 14, my dad coming up to me and he said, well, son, in this life you can work harder or you can work smarter. And this is what working harder looks like. So why don't you go to school and try and work smarter? So now I get to sit in the air conditioning on a day like today. So I always like to thank Dad for that lesson. So anyway, that's sort of where I'm coming from. And so I'm going to talk to you about farm succession planning in the context of just your overall estate planning. And the three big areas we're going to talk about are just, in general, what are the best practices for either farm succession planning and or just estate planning generally. And I'm probably going to spend a bit of time on this because we just heard a lot about conservation easements in the first part. And so I'm going to sort of cover a little bit of background on just estate planning and succession planning, and then incorporate into that, if you are considering something like a conservation easement, well, how's that going to affect everything we're going to talk about on the estate planning and the succession planning side. And then finally, at the very end, I'll just reiterate the importance of creating a plan and who you should involve when you're putting together a plan for yourself on any of these levels, estate planning, succession planning, or thinking about doing something like a conservation easement. Okay. So this first slide is how I think about estate planning, and it may not be the way most people think about estate planning, because a lot of people, when they think about just their estate plan, they might come in on the bottom right here and just think about documents. An estate plan is a will, it's a trust, it's a power of attorney. And that's normally where you're thinking about getting a lawyer involved, putting together these documents, and having something on paper that's then going to be there for your lifetime and then at your death. But I think the most important part of estate planning is really in that word planning. And so that's why at the very top of the slide here, I've got the word decisions. Because estate planning starts not with a document, it starts with you thinking about what you own, who that's going to, and under what conditions you want to hand that down. Either during your lifetime or at your death through your will. And these decisions, if you're going to do them the right way, should take a little bit of time because you have a lot of things to decide when you're thinking about your estate plan or the succession plan for something like a farm or a business. Those decisions might be, just who am I leaving this to? Who's going to come after me? Who are my beneficiaries? Who do I want to inherit whatever I have to leave? Those decisions might be, who do I want in charge of this process? Who am I going to name as my executor? Who am I going to name as a power of attorney to help take care of me during my lifetime or to help carry out these plans I've made that maybe I can't get them to the finish line, but I want someone else to be able to do that for me. And then only after you've really made and thought about those decisions should you go on to the next stage, which are the documents. Because the documents are only there to act as sort of a memorial for those decisions. So if you've decided, I own this piece of land or I own this farm, I'm leaving this to my children, well, you should really have a document in place saying that's what's going to happen. And under what conditions is that going to happen? Is this an outright gift? Is there any sort of trust on the land? Are you giving someone a right of first refusal to purchase the land? We see this very often in families where there are multiple children and we have to decide, are all the children going to inherit the land equally? Does one child have more of an interest in the land or in the farm? And what does that mean for a child that might be left out of that? So these are something your documents can put a plan into place to deal with. But again, as an attorney who drafts documents, I'm really only as useful as the quality of the decisions that go into those documents. Because I can give you a great will that looks looks beautiful on paper, but if it doesn't match your intent or what's important to the family, it's not going to help you in the long run. And then this third word over here on the left, review, has two different meanings. One, there's always a review just in the estate planning process. You make these decisions, you draft a document, and then you always want to have a review session with that document just to go over it one more time and say, okay, am I sure about this? Now that I see it on paper, do I still feel the same way as when I was just talking on the phone with the attorney about this? And another great thing about this review process, from the very first time you make an estate plan or any sort of succession plan, is this is really the stage where I encourage clients, as much as they feel comfortable, bring in the next generation at that review stage. If you have adult children, they're going to be the beneficiaries of this plan or the executors who are expected to carry out this plan. Bring them in at that review stage, because whether you want to hear it or not, their feedback is very important. And I've sat in on many client meetings where we've done the decision making, we've drafted the documents, they bring their adult children in just for that final review, just to say, hey, here's what we're doing, here's your role in it. And the kids will bring something up. They'll say, well, what about this? I don't feel like I'm being treated fairly. What about my sibling? Why is this sibling in charge and this one isn't? And sometimes it's as simple as the parents just saying, well, here's why I did what I did, and that gets everyone on the same page. Or sometimes the parents will take that feedback and then go back and make a change in the documents. I had a client 2 or 3 years ago where they had a son and a daughter. They, I think, correctly realized their daughter was the more responsible of the two, and so they made her the executor or the trustee, and they were just worried about their son, and so they wanted her to hold back his part of the inheritance until he was at least, I think, 35. And they brought the daughter in on that review meeting, and the daughter was about 32. I think the son was 30 at that time. And the daughter said, well, I understand, Mom and Dad, you're making me the trustee, you're concerned about my brother, but I don't want to be his babysitter. I don't want him to come to me and think that I'm standing between him and his money. And so the parents took that suggestion and they added a provision in their document that said the trustee may terminate this trust early for any reason. And the daughter was very happy to have that provision in there. And it made her feel that, okay, even if things go very wrong between me and my brother, I'm not locked in this contentious situation with him. And so that brought the daughter and the parents together, and she said, okay, great, I'll do whatever you want me to do. And so bringing other people in when you can, if your beneficiaries are 12 years old, you're not going to bring them to that review. But if they're adults, and especially if they're expected to take a part in this plan you're putting together, let them see the document before you sign on the dotted line. That can be a very good thing to do. And the other part of this review word is this is also for you as the person putting together the plan. No matter what your plan is, we hope that we're making it with the best information we have today in 2025. But things can change over time. And so very often I will tell clients, roughly every 5 years or so, for everyone it's different, 5 years, 7 years, something like that, you should come back and review this entire plan, review those decisions. Is there something different in 2030 that if I had known about it back in 2025, I'd have made a different decision? Because during your lifetime, all these documents we're talking about can be amended, they can be changed. Your will, any trust you might have, powers of attorney, you can keep updating these based on new information. And so this cycle can and probably should play out a couple different times in your lifetime based on what's changing with you, what's changing in the family, what might be changing with your land or with the farm. And so these are just, in general, sort of some key topics I would think about as to how should you think about estate planning or just succession planning for something like a farm. And then real quickly, just to hit a few specifics, again, I don't want to get too deep on any one of these. In the document category, documents include both things that take effect at your death, like a will, who's getting this property that I have in my name and then in my lifetime. There's also documents that take care of you during your lifetime. These are your powers of attorney, advance directives, living wills, things that will take effect for you during your lifetime, and most of them are about who's making a decision for me if I can't make that decision for myself. If I get sick, if I have a traumatic injury, or if I have a slowly developing condition like dementia or Alzheimer's, and I have this plan in place, I would say especially if you have an operating farm where decisions have to be made on an annual or more frequent basis, and you're the landowner, well, who's making that decision for you if you can't do it? Is it your spouse? Is it your child? Is there a reason it shouldn't be one of those people? Should it be someone who knows more about the farm and how it works and what goes into it just as a business? Those are all decisions you can make that will inform how you set up these documents. And so again, don't think about estate planning as just what happens after I die. The word estate just means property. And you own property during your lifetime. How that property is managed is very important, and your estate planning documents, again, can help control that both during your lifetime and at your death. Go to the next slide. Okay. So that was just a little bit about estate planning in general, and those are topics that I think apply to anyone who owns property. It doesn't have to be a farm or a business. If you have anything in your name, estate planning is important. Farm succession planning adds a layer on top of this because a farm or just land ownership in general can be a little bit different than just a family that has their house, a car, and a bank account, and that's it. So think about what a farm is. A farm, I think number one is land. It's kind of the foundation of a farm. If you don't have land, you don't have what we would typically think of as a farm. A farm is very often equipment or implements that go on the land. What do you use to work the land? Different farms will have different amounts of equipment that they need. A farm is money. Very important for anyone who's ever owned a working farm or worked as part of a farm. Money is a huge part of it. I grew up on a tobacco farm. I think we brought in money 2 months out of the year. And that's when we sold the tobacco in the fall. We spent money 12 months out of the year. And that balance could be a little delicate sometimes. And it's something not only to think about for you during your lifetime as a landowner is how is the land paying for itself if it's expected to do that, but how's that going to happen when I leave this land to someone else? Are they going to have the same ability to use the proceeds of the land to pay for its expenses as I am? Is there going to be a continuing farming operation that's going to keep generating money? What does that look like? If you have a tree farm, you're not collecting money once a year. You might be collecting money once every 20 to 50 years. But again, you have expenses every year. So what does that look like for you? And especially for the planning context, what does that look like for those who come after you? Can they afford to wait that long to get something out of the land? And then at the bottom, even though it's fourth on this list, it may be most important from the planning context are the people. A farm is people. It's the landowner. It's potentially people who work on the farm, either as managers or as field hands, whatever position they might have. And in the context of succession planning, people are the ones who come after you. They're the future owners, the future operators of this farm, the future managers of this land. And going back to the last slide, when I talked about the review process, getting those people involved in reviewing what the succession plan is very important because they might have very different ideas than your ideas about how should this land be managed, how's it going to work for future generations, are they going to do all the things that you're doing to make the land productive and either to make a living off of it or at the very least to keep it as sort of a self-sustaining farm where the farm can pay for itself and you're not expecting people to come out of their own pockets from their other sources of income just to keep this farm up or this land up after you're out of the picture. So in looking at these different things, you can see that you could have a conversation on any of these topics with all the people involved in your estate plan. And I'm going to jump to the next slide now because I'm going to start to bring in sort of the conservation easement and how might that affect all of these areas. But before I move on, are there any just general estate planning questions that anyone might want to ask now before I sort of layer in the conservation easements? Yeah, it could go in a lot of directions, but it's your chance to ask a question without a consult fee, so take advantage of it. I'm going to jump to the next slide. All right, so conservation easements. We've just had a great presentation from Chris about the process, how you would get started, all the steps you have to go through. So a conservation easement is clearly a very big decision. It's not one you'd enter into lightly, and the process kind of makes it so that you can't really enter into it quickly. You can't say today I want a conservation easement, and then 3 months from now it's, oh, I signed it and I didn't have enough time to review it. It's going to take a while, and so it's going to give you a lot of time to think about that. In the estate and succession planning context, think about what effect, if you go through this process, this is going to have on some of these key areas of something like large land ownership or a farm in specific. So kind of the most obvious one, I think, is the effect on the land. As you just heard in Chris's presentation, if you do a conservation easement on the land, you are taking some things off the table. You are saying, in some way, I'm restricting what this land can be used for in the future. There's a lot of reasons you might want to do that, but when you start looking long-term at what makes sense for me and for my lifetime, what makes sense for my children in their lifetime, or even beyond that, multiple generations down the line, what am I leaving them? Because one of the things you can do as a property owner in, I think, every state in the U.S., I can't speak for Louisiana, they're on their own civil law system, is as an owner of property, kind of what that means, ownership means you control what happens to it. Meaning during your lifetime, you can buy property, you can sell property, you can give property away. You can do pretty much all those things at your death as well. We have estate laws in place that say I, as the property owner, can say, where does this piece of property in my name go when I'm no longer here? Again, I can give it away to someone. I can write in my will that I require it to be sold and everyone divides up the money. You have a lot of options, but if you place a conservation easement on your land, you're now giving away something less than 100% ownership in the land. If you just own your piece of land outright with no easements, no restrictions on it, you're effectively able to give away in your estate planning 100% of the potential of that land. It could be a farm, it could be developed, it could just be left to grow wild, it could be anything. An easement says, well, now I'm leaving this land on to the next generation or whoever you're leaving it to. I'm not leaving it subject to this easement. This easement goes with the land, whether I choose to give it away or sell it during my lifetime, or whether I choose to pass it on to the next generation at my death. Now, going back to some of those people that might be involved in your plan, how might they feel about that? And very often, unless you have one child or one beneficiary, anytime you have two or more people in a room together, you have room for two or more opinions. And what if you have multiple children and they feel differently about it? What if some of them are all in favor of land conservation and they'd be perfectly happy just to inherit a piece of land that has to be a farm, preserved for wildlife or natural resources? They're completely on board with it, and you may have another beneficiary that's not on board with that. Well, again, as part of your estate planning, maybe in the context of getting a conservation easement, you may decide to put a conservation easement on some but not all of your farmland. Or a conservation easement can be a way that you, as the landowner now, kind of cast the deciding vote for future generations. Where if you have children going in different directions, one would sell it to the highest bidder tomorrow for any purpose whatsoever, and one would want to keep it the way they know it, the way they've seen you use it during your lifetime. Well, a conservation easement can be your way of saying, I'm breaking the tie. I'm giving it to both of you, but here's the universe of possibilities are only the ones I've carved out in this easement. And again, especially if they know that ahead of time, and it's not a surprise to them when they inherit this land from you, you've given them some time to talk with you about that, to come to terms with, okay, what am I inheriting? And you can help to fight against that symptom that I see in some families where the next generation just sees an inheritance in terms of dollar signs. Like, I'm going to inherit this land. On paper, it's worth $5 million. Therefore, I'm going to get $2.5 million. It's like, well, no, not exactly. But again, having that conversation with them that says, yes, you will one day inherit this land, but let's talk about that. Here's what I'm doing. Here's why I'm doing it. You can head off a lot of disagreements before they start. The effect on the money. Conservation easements can be donated or they can be purchased. If an easement is being purchased, well, you as the landowner are getting some financial benefit out of this. As was brought up briefly, there may be tax benefits, both from sort of locking in almost a permanent land use valuation. I mean, you reduce the market value, and therefore you'll be taxed at a lower value for property taxes going forward. If any portion of the easement was donated by you, like either a bargain sale or just a complete and total donation, you should have a tax deduction on that, which you may be able to use in different ways. The other effect on the money is, as we talked about earlier, farms take money to run. They take money to pay expenses throughout the year. You know, what if you have a farm that's subject to some debt? What if you have a farm that needs some liquidity to make improvements to infrastructure, to make it sustainable for the long term? Could you use something like an easement to gain access to some funding to then set up that farm so that it'll pay for itself? It can keep going in an agricultural use in a way that you're leaving a sustainable operation to the next generation. And then, again, third, but certainly not the least important point, is the effect of conservation easements on the people associated with the land. And there's a couple different ways to think about this. You know, the most obvious one might be the people who are going to be the future owners of this land. You know, it's a big deal to them whether or not this land has a conservation easement or not. And does that align with their goals and expectations, or does it not? But also there are people who may be involved with the farm who aren't owners. Maybe there's people who work on the farm. There's people for whom this farm provides part of their livelihood, even if they're not an owner. And can you give those people some reassurance by saying, I'm placing a conservation easement on this land so that it will remain in agricultural use in one form or another in perpetuity? Well, that kind of tells people who work on the farm that their job might not be going away when the owner dies. So again, that has an effect on them. Just because they're involved with the land, they're involved with the farm in some way. Now, conservation easements, I'm sure, can affect more areas than this, but these are the, sort of, I guess, the three key ones that I thought about just when putting together this presentation. And then, next slide. This, again, ties back to our review point, but when you're putting together an estate plan, a farm succession plan, and I would say in the context of conservation easements, when you're considering adding this in to part of the inheritance that you're leaving to the next generation, who are the people you should be talking to? And again, the people on the left are probably the ones that you would think about from a pure estate planning context. Of course, these people would be involved: attorneys, CPAs, financial advisors, bankers or business advisors if it's an ongoing operation. A lot of the resources that Chris mentioned that we have in the room today, specific to the ag and natural resources sector, if you have land or a farm, those are sort of your professional advisors you're talking to. But the other people are definitely those family members who might be beneficiaries, executors, and powers of attorney. And for this point, I think I have a separate slide on this, but I want to bring it up now in the context of family, is the sort of the why of you. Why would you create an estate plan, a succession plan? Why put all this thought into these decisions and what you're leaving on to the next generation? Is a big question, is what sort of legacy are you going to leave? And legacy means something different to every person. The way I think of it is, how are you remembered? If someone thinks of you, especially if it's your children, your grandchildren, someone in the future generations, what is the first thing they're going to think of? Is it going to be, here was the person who passed down this farm or this land to us, and here's how it worked out? Or is it going to be, oh wow, we remember Grandma's estate, it was a mess, and it was terrible. And just to maybe drive home the point of how important legacy is, I'm going to use one more example from my own family history. So the tobacco farm I grew up in was inherited from my father's mother. So it was ultimately his grandfather on that side of the family who left us the land that my dad continued the farming tradition for. Well, my dad also had land at one point on his father's side of the family. And his grandfather had 2 sons, and he owned a dairy farm. And this was back in the 40s, 50s, and early 60s. And I don't think people did quite as much talking about their estate plan maybe back then as they might today. And there was always an assumption in the family that the farms could be left to the 2 boys. It's kind of what you would expect. Dad had 2 sons, both grew up on the farm. they're going to inherit the farm. Well, that's not what happened. Instead, he left the farm to one son and not to the other. And he never explained why he did that. And so all sorts of theories were put forth and family stories about the will got changed and there was all sorts of, bad intentions behind the scene. I don't know if any of those were true because this happened more than 20 years before I was born. But I can tell you that I am now 37 years old. I have never met a second cousin from that side of the family. And so 3 generations later, the legacy of my great-grandfather is, the first thing I think about is that dairy farm and how I don't know my cousins. So think about that from your point of view as landowners. How can this go? What are my children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren? You don't even know. What are they going to think about when they think about you and what you did with this land? And having those maybe difficult discussions with children now can pay dividends down the road. Because going back to the point that a couple people have raised of, well, why would you do a conservation easement? Aren't you tying people's hands in the future? And in some ways you are. But if you're going to make that decision, I think the worst thing you can do is make that a surprise for people. Because again, if people don't know why you did something, they'll start to fill in their own reasons for why you did it. It's like, oh, I bet they didn't trust me. Or I bet they didn't care about the things that I cared about. Or they didn't want to leave me this inheritance, so they put a restriction on it. Whereas talking about them, and again, they may talk you out of it, which might be a good thing in the long run, but letting them hear it from you. This is what I'm doing. This is why I'm doing it. If you have any questions about it, ask me now. That will set your family up for a lot less stress, a lot less heartache in the long run. So we sort of hit the highlights of a lot of different topics. Like Chris, I like to leave time for questions. I'm happy to go back into anything anyone has questions about, but just anything from those topics and those discussions that you'd like to know more about, ask specific questions on, or just things that estate planning in the context of this conservation easement discussion. Anything I can give you to help you make more informed decisions on that front. Yes?
One quick question. If a farm is in an LLC at the business of the farm, how does that relate in terms of inheritance and succession to the land itself and any other sort of assets of the family?
So, 2 things. One, just from a conservation easement point of view, the easement runs with the land. So whoever owns the land, the easement goes with it. Now from an estate planning, succession planning point of view, what an LLC does is it basically creates a layer of personal property on top of a layer of real property. And so if you are the sole owner of an LLC that owns either a piece of land, a farming operation, whatever it is, a farm as a business, what you're actually leaving to your beneficiaries is ownership in that LLC. And so anything the LLC owns, whether it's farmland, equipment, anything that goes into that farm, that's all part of that LLC. And just by you saying, I leave my interest to my spouse or to my children, they're getting everything that goes with that. Now your estate planning, just like any other piece of property, can say subject to certain conditions, provided they have to be at least a certain age, provided that I pick one person as a trustee to manage all the decisions of this LLC going forward, because not everyone in the family knows what goes into a farm and how to run it. And they'll also, ideally, especially if there's more than one owner of an LLC, there should be a document governing that LLC as in the form of an operating agreement that says, how do we pick the managers? Just because ownership might get split up multiple ways over the generations, how do we come to a decision that maybe these 1 or 2 people are actually in charge? And when I'm leaving this LLC out to my family members, am I leaving it to them all equally? Are they all getting voting interests in it? Or are certain family members going to be in charge of the decision making, whereas everyone benefits from the economic interest? So if the LLC makes money, maybe the money goes out to everyone, but not everyone has an equal vote in deciding, do we turn the farm into tree land or not? So the main thing the LLC does is it does allow you to have this extra layer of almost like customization where you can say, this farm as a business, how's it run? And regardless of what happens to the ownership structure, how do we pick the managers and how are decisions made? And that's important anytime you have a farm, whether it's in the LLC or not, is who's making the decisions after the primary landowner has passed on. Who decides if it should be in trees or in cattle? You know, who decides to invest in more infrastructure? Who decides these things? And again, is it everyone equally, or is it just a few people who have the most experience and are better positioned to make those decisions?
One quick follow-up to that. As a simple example, let's say there's one individual remaining that owns the farm. They pass away and they leave it to the one child that remains, and it's willed to them, which I presume is outside of the estate. When does the ownership change to that person? Is it when the will is recorded?
So when you say you're willing it to them, is it just the land or is it the LLC?
No, forget the LLC. Let's say it's just the farm. It's not in an LLC. I'm willing this to my son.
The land is assumed legally to transfer as of the previous owner's date of death. Now, we may not know who that owner is until the will is recorded.
Right.
But let's say the will is recorded 2 weeks later. It relates back to the previous owner's date of death. And normally where I encounter that most is the question of who pays the property taxes. Because, you know, you can say, oh, we didn't record the will until after the tax bill came, but my dad died before the taxes were due, and so therefore the taxes actually fall on the new owner, not on his estate. So that's where, practically, that's where it becomes an issue. But it's always, as soon as one owner dies, legally, if it's land, someone else owns it the next day. We just might need to file the will a couple weeks later to confirm who that person was. Yes?
Speak some about the value of trusts as a way to bridge the death of one set of family to the next set of family.
Yeah. So the concept of trust, and the reason they're important and sometimes very useful in the estate planning context, is a trust it has a lot of uses, but one of the most common uses you will see for a trust is to avoid the county probate process. And the biggest problem with the county probate process, well, the two biggest ones are time, meaning until your executor gets your death certificate, files your will with the county, and gets those letters of authority, they can't do anything. So if you have a bank account in your name, if there's a decision that needs to be made with the land in that intervening period, until the estate process starts, no one can do anything. So there's a period of time there, depending on which county you're in, that can be a couple weeks or a couple months, where everything's kind of frozen, nothing's happening. What a trust does, because it is a document that does not rely on the county for its authority, a trust is basically a contract that you sign now, maybe even with yourself as the initial trustee and with someone else as a successor trustee that comes in after you. That contract or that trust exists today as soon as you sign it. So you're not waiting for a county clerk of court to come in after your death and validate it and give someone authority. If you name someone as a trustee to act upon your death, the next day after someone's death, that trustee is there. And so if that trust owns title to land, bank accounts, an LLC that holds all these land and bank accounts and equipment, you avoid that gap in control where there's no period of no one can sign anything, no decisions can be made. And for any situation where continuity of control is really important, those are the situations we would start to talk to clients about some form of trust to bridge that gap. The other thing trusts are very good at is because they're continuous, you have continuous access to funds that are in the trust. And this can be important in the farming context where if checks need to be written on a weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly basis, you want someone who can keep writing those checks out to pay workers on the farm, to pay bills and expenses that are coming due, to keep the business of the farm going. It can also be important, even outside the farming context, if you have beneficiaries or people that depend on you for support, and if no one can access your bank accounts for a month or two, is that really going to be harmful to someone? Well, if you have a trust set up, anything you put in that trust is still available during that interim period. And so people with minor children as dependents, or anyone who just relies on them for support on a regular basis, a trust can be a great tool to say, either my entire estate or a significant portion of it, I have assigned to this trust document. And I've picked someone in advance to have immediate access to that property and to those funds in the event of my death so that they can keep making those payments for me. And most people who set up a trust will also have it set up so that that person could step in either upon death or incapacity. So again, if you're just disabled, if you have a long-term illness, if you have slowly progressing dementia, the trust can be set up so that someone can just sort of take over from you during your lifetime if they need to. But certainly at your death, you've got someone set up who immediately could keep doing things if they need to do them. Yes?
Hi, I'm a real estate agent, so I should know the answer to these. But I have friends, there are 3 siblings who just inherited their parents' property. They're mostly, the properties are mostly in Granville County, one's at the coast, but there are 6 properties, 2 are large and 4 are kind of smaller. They're trying to divide the land up just, value-wise. And they're asking me, should we just change title on the properties, let my sister have this one, or do we sell it to each other? Is there a basis date? Is that when their parents, the last parent died? Because they're just inheriting these straight. What is your guidance on that?
So there's 2 parts. There's a tax part of that, and then there's a having everyone get along part of it. And in some cases, the one about having everyone get along and agree they were treated fairly, it's the most difficult because it's the most open to interpretation. Meaning, these 3 people, what do they think all this land is worth? And they may have very different ideas about what it's worth. And even if you get an appraisal, if the appraisal doesn't say what they think it should say, they might not accept it. Because on the one hand, they can do whatever they want. It's as if, when they inherited this property, it's as if they all bought it 3 ways together. And so the fact that they want to turn around the next day and trade with each other, they can agree to whatever they want to agree to. The question is, are they all going to be happy with that? Are they all going to agree that the Granville County property is worth this, the beach property is worth this, and therefore, this is what is equal at the end of the day? Now, the tax question, in some ways, is the better question for a lawyer because it has a definite answer, which is the step up in basis you get on real estate occurs as of date of death of the previous owner, assuming that property transfers as a result of their death. So not that they gifted it to a trust 20 years ago that then paid out at their death. It's they owned it, and either through their will or just through their estate without a will, the day the landowner dies and it goes to a new landowner, that's the date you value it for basis purposes. So if they're exchanging the property fairly close in time to when that date of death occurred, the odds are the value won't have changed a whole lot. Again, you have to agree as to what it was. But that's when the basis got stepped up. So that's one part of the tax question. Now the other part is, do we buy each other out or do we just trade deeds basically? Do we all just sign a bunch of deeds that say, okay, the new ownership is this, but no money changes hands? In theory, if all the values are exactly equal and you had the same value of land ownership before as you do on the other side, was there a gain or a loss? I don't think so. Where it gets tricky is that if the family is agreeing to something where there's an unequal value, where even though they realize the beach property is worth more, it's cleaner if we just let one person own that and the rest of the people have the Granville County property. If the end result of that process is someone ends up with more value than the others and no money changes hands, the ones who ended up with less have made a gift to the person who ended up with more because they agreed to transfer something to that person and got nothing back for it. Now, depending on their estates, that may or may not be a big deal, but it's something they need to be aware of, is that if at the end of this process, if we inherit it equally and we do a bunch of deeds to each other that we end up unequal, someone has made a gift to someone else, and they need to be aware of that and talk to a lawyer or CPA to see, do we need to file a gift tax return? So again, if it works out that everything's perfectly equal, then you avoid that.
How would anyone know that? Would that
One,
the IRS would follow up, or?
no, it would be if you got audited
Okay.
and they see some property transactions. Now, again, how likely is that? I don't know. It would probably be something else going on in their lives that triggered the audit risk. But then once you're in an audit, they can kind of go back and look after it.
Crazy sister who makes life heck, So
Yes.
they're willing to gift to just.
Yeah, that would be one potential way it would come up. Or someone takes part of the land and then maybe tries to donate it, or maybe they put a conservation easement on it. And then they claim a tax deduction and get audited. And then all of a sudden the IRS says, oh, where did you get this land from? So that's kind of where it would go. But no, there'd be no in-the-moment check of they signed the deed and someone comes in the next day and says that wasn't perfectly equal. That wouldn't happen. Yes.
When you're talking about trading around, are you talking about quit claims? Is that the same or
that's-
different from what you're saying?
That's a form of it, yes. Basically, any form of deed to each other. The quitclaim would probably be the most maybe commonly used one, especially in the farm and land context. But what's a quitclaim deed, a warranty deed? Anything you sign that gives ownership to someone else, no matter what form of deed it is, that would be you trading it around. That, again, if it's inherited property, you'd probably rather it be a quitclaim deed because you don't want to guarantee what title you're giving away or what title your parents had 100 years ago or anything like that. So, yeah, quitclaim deed would be one way to think about it. Okay, anything else? Yes?
My understanding in creating a conservation easement agreement, your team would be creating it with the best interest of the county in mind, and then I'm assuming the homeowner hires their own attorney to review it to make sure their best interests are also, just like double checking or any typos or something. Like, is that how that typically works?
So the lawyer's obligation is about who hires us, who's our client,
Sure.
who are we representing. And it's very important to know if you're doing a conservation easement or any other type of land transaction, the settlement attorney, who are they representing at closing? And I would say the more complicated the transaction is, maybe the better it is, or better idea it is for you to have your own attorney look at it and say, they're telling me this is what it means. Does it actually mean that?
So is that what most people do, is there's an attorney for the county and there's also an attorney for the owner?
I don't know what most people do. I might defer this question to Brian.
Yeah, so I do the nuts and bolts closing process. I'm a real estate lawyer. Jason and I work together at the same firm, but I do the real estate portion, and I've been working with the county and others for some 20 years on closing these easement transactions. So it just depends. Some landowners have, a family lawyer or another lawyer specific to the conservation easement transaction that they have review everything as it goes along the process. And some landowners don't. We make it clear that we do, in fact, represent the county in the process, and we have a document that we ask the landowner to sign. We're happy to, answer questions that we can, but we can't give you any legal advice about what the easement means for you or your family, because we do, in fact, represent the county in the transaction. So as a lawyer, what I would say is hire a lawyer. Hire a lawyer to help you understand so you're 100% sure what it is that you're signing. And we were not ethically able to give you legal advice, even if we wanted to, because of course our duty of loyalty is with our client, the county in this case. So yeah, we would recommend, that everybody is considering a conservation hire a lawyer to get all their legal questions answered.
And I'll just kind of add to that, the easement draft that you receive from me, it's based on either a federal or state template, or in the terms of, I've discussed with some people donations in which we use a county template. That template was drafted by the county attorney's office. It is then altered, amended, and adjusted for your specific goals by me, and then sent back to the staff attorney for approval of those alterations. And so it's been reviewed and drafted by the county attorney and or staff attorney, and then I've made amendments and changes. And then when we go to close, as Brian and Jason have suggested, they're really just reviewing it to make sure that it fits state and legal requirements and county, in the interest of the county. And so, there's not anything kind of underhanded in that situation.
Sure.
But in all proceeds, all process of me working with you towards the closing of that easement, and I've caught a little bit of flack from some landowners in the past that said, "What? You didn't?" I always recommend reviewing and discussing all easement documents and potential tax implications with either a family attorney, a hired attorney, tax official, CPA. And I will say in my time here, in about 8 or 9 conservation easements closed, I've only had one person who brought their own attorney to review those things. So just want to make mention of that.
If, I think I picked up something about trusts, when you were speaking. If you place a trust, land in a trust like today, and then in 20 years, your successor takes over, and 5 years later, they decide to sell it, does that mean the cost basis for capital gains was 25 years ago?
It depends on the kind of trust. The most basic type of trust most people will use just to avoid probate is what's normally called a living trust or revocable trust. Anytime you still maintain the right to basically unilaterally terminate the trust, change it, pull the property back out, you have not parted with ownership enough to cause a change in ownership from a tax perspective. So most people that just have what I'll call a pure probate avoidance trust, the step up in basis still occurs at their date of death because they maintain control over it all the way up until that day. The point I was making about, was it gifted to a trust 20 years ago? In some situations, people might have a different trust because they are trying to get assets out of their name for tax purposes, where there's a different trustee, they don't have the right to come back and change the terms. And so there are certain types of trust you might set up that would lock in the value at a much earlier date. But again, if you're just setting up a probate avoidance estate management trust, those are almost always drafted specifically to still be included in your estate. Therefore, title would still transfer as a result of your death, which is the trigger to get the basis step up at your death. And then one other point, just because we had this brief question about the attorney and who do they represent? Do they represent me or not in an easement closing situation? In an estate planning context, your attorney-client relationship is between you, the person who makes the plan, and your attorney. And it is up to you who else you involve in the picture. So for example, I've talked about situations where clients would bring their adult children into the meeting with them to say, let's talk about the plan, what I'm doing, and why. If you're doing that, you're authorizing your attorney to communicate with your child, at least just for that one meeting. It doesn't mean they can now call your attorney and ask them a bunch of questions about you and your plan. Again, unless you tell the attorney, yes, you were allowed to talk to my son or daughter or whoever. But just know that that representation stays between you and the attorney. It doesn't automatically transfer to your children after your death. They can always choose to work with the same attorney if they want to, but that's a decision that's up to them. Some people will say in their documents that, or they'll want to say in their documents that I want my executor or my children to keep using the same attorney or the same law firm. You really can't require them to do that because they'd be a new client. They get to pick their own lawyer. And so it's always up to them who they use. But just know that you have attorney-client confidentiality with your lawyer, and it's up to you who you let into that bubble. And there are certain situations where I do encourage clients to let people in, at least for that limited purpose of just talk about your documents, especially if that person has a role to play in your document. If they're the executor, if they're the trustee, they should probably ask some questions ahead of time about, well, what do I have to do? What does this mean for me? But it doesn't mean that they now have the right to your entire estate file during your lifetime. You always control with your attorney how much do they discuss with other people or how much do they not. Okay. Yes?
Can't really underscore enough the perpetual nature of a conservation easement, and that it's something that carries forward forever. And I just was wondering whether either of you, might be able to share the top 3 snags, the top 3 issues that you've seen with conservation easements that people in the room might benefit from knowing as they consider easements. Is that something you're comfortable doing? Just generally, where are those hiccups that hindsight really could have avoided family issues or other issues around an easement?
The main one that comes to mind for me is just the communication point with what are the expectations of the next generation. And the bigger the disparity between the expectations and the reality, the more chance there is for a real contentious situation later where people are trying to come back and undo the easement or make modifications to the easement. And they're struggling in this process that they feel like they've had this easement imposed upon them and they're fighting back against it. I think that would almost always come up in a situation where they had no involvement with the original grant of the easement. They weren't involved in that conversation. And that can be very tricky if, again, if the next generation is still too young to have that conversation. If you don't have adult children in their 30s and 40s who are able to come in and discuss that with the parents, if the beneficiaries are still much younger than that at the time you make the easement decision, you can't do it right then, but you can probably do it later in your lifetime. So even if you've already decided on the easement, as the next generation is old enough to be involved in that conversation, still bring them in, still talk about, look, this is what I'm doing with the land, this is how I'm managing it now, this is how I expect it's going to be managed over the long term, and here's what you need to know about that. So just communication is the main point that comes up from me. I don't know, Brian, do you have any other?
Yeah, just much more practical. So I'm looking at title of the property, making sure the owner owns what they think they own. And a lot of times they just don't. We heard some comments about neighbors maybe have encroached over the years. A lot of this farmland is passed down generation to generation through wills, not through deeds, right? So like Jason said, property passes on your date of death. Sometimes the only conveyance instrument is your will that says, you know, the 5 acres over on the hill, we're going to give here, the 3 down by the creek, you know, we're going to give there. And then the family knows what that is on the first generation, but 5 generations later, perhaps or 3 or 4, we're trying to put it all back together and figure out who owns what. It can be very challenging. So if you have some family history and you're thinking about a conservation easement, maybe start putting that together if this property has been inherited through wills rather than through deeds with really good descriptions over time. It makes the title search go a lot easier. We're looking at family trees a lot of times, you know, that are, you know, on poster board size instruments, trying to figure out who really owns what. And sometimes we're chasing down heirs that people didn't even think they had an interest. There's fractional interest from a generation ago that now has fractionalized 5 other, you know, through 5 other folks. And so the title can be really challenging to track down on some of these farms. And the other thing I'll say, just as a that comes up from time to time and people don't anticipate, if you have financing on your property, if you've borrowed money for, you know, either a short-term loan for a crop or for a longer-term financing of a home, perhaps that you've constructed on the property, that deed of trust, that loan you got, must be subordinated to the conservation easement, meaning your lender is going to have to agree that their interest in the property that's secured by that loan, right, their deed of trust is going to be subordinated to the easement. So the easement has priority in records. So if you default on the loan, the bank's not going to be able to foreclose on the easement. The easement has to survive that process in order for it to be eligible for these tax benefits and for these programs that we're talking about. It can't be defeasible by a mortgage. So just know that some lenders are happy to work with you, but because when you place the conservation easement, there is a decrease in property value, some lenders are concerned about that, right? That their security is impaired. And so it's a process to work through the subordination. So if you have existing financing deeds of trust or loans secured against your property, you need to start working through that earlier in the process rather than later, because it can take some time to get the subordination. So that's sort of a technical thing that we hit from time to time.
And on the point of knowing sort of what you own and has it been passed down by will or by a deed, you know, I recently helped a client who was deeding a family farm that he and his brother inherited out to an LLC because they're going to manage it as an LLC. One brother's going to be the manager. The other brother just maintains the right to receive income from the farm. And in doing the title search on that, we found it traced back through multiple estates to a very old deed, and part of the legal description was it ran to a ditch, and thence with said ditch up so many feet. Well, that ditch isn't in the same place 80 years later that it was then. And so that was a wrinkle that we had to go back and talk to the clients about, of, okay, where exactly is this? What do you own? And this deed from the 1920s is making it a little harder on us today. And also just another point, when you're talking about fractional interest, someone who didn't even know they had an interest in the property, almost every will or every trust that's kind of acting as a will have something in there called a residuary clause, which is I may have specific things above that I want this child to have the beach house, this child to have the farm or whatever. And there's always going to be a clause that says, and anything else I may own, even if I don't know about it, I leave to so-and-so. And so, again, if you think you've delineated all the real property, all the farm interest in one part of the will, but then the residuary clause goes to someone else, or you may have inadvertently sent an interest in real estate somewhere down the line that you don't even know about. And so again, it goes back to the estate planning process, the farm succession planning, which is if you're putting together an estate plan for someone that you know has significant real estate holdings, that might be a question that we ask. Instead of just a generic residuary clause that says, well, just everything to my kids equally, we might say, well, let's back up and let's say any real estate I may own, maybe should that go just to this trust I'm setting up or just to these children and these beneficiaries that are holding the land, so that I don't accidentally send some inherited piece of property from my great-grandfather I didn't know I had out to someone who, had I known that, I would have made a different decision. But again, that's just one way that people who either pass away without a will or with a will that doesn't take into account land ownership as a very special part of that person's estate, you can send partial interest in land in some unintended directions.
Just following up on that, I think trying to make land available for a farmer in the future, if you're considering putting something into an easement, I'd ask you to consider the affordability of that parcel to someone who would authentically farm it, as opposed to someone who just has the money, especially with homes that, really increase the value of a parcel. You could say, yes, I'm going to put 150 acres with a home in an easement, in a single easement, single parcel. That would likely be unaffordable and out of reach for a farmer. So really considering, what I like to think of is 50 acres or so, and sometimes certainly include parcels that don't include a home on it or infrastructure, because that really increases the value. So what Chris was saying earlier is real important, to scope out the property and, if needed, divide it into more than one parcel so it's actually affordable in the future to a farmer, just because land prices are so out of reach for people to buy and who want to farm.
Any other questions?
That actually brings up a question I had, which sounds like the answer is yes, but if you have individual parcels that are all covered by one easement, in the future they could be owned by different parties, right? Like right now they're all under one owner, but they're different parcels. If you wanted to leave them to different successors or whatever, you could do that, right?
The easement document speaks to that directly and generally says you need to keep it under single ownership. I mean, that's what most documents say. And that's why carving out a separate parcel, like Noah was mentioning, is something, to think about at the outset, right? Now, different easement documents may have different requirements about that. The county's easement document in particular sort of assumes it's going to be held in common ownership.
We do have some older easements that had that situation where they had already created those subdivisions. Some that say, as long as it's passed down to a direct descendant or family member. And so it's like the subdivision's hold in place. It doesn't hold the single owner requirement, but it does hold the requirement that the person has to be directly related to that, the original owner. And
It'd be a different perspective.
It'd be a lot harder to get those.
I was just gonna add, so the multiple easement or multiple parcels per easement, either you do it ahead of time, or you can actually do multiple easement closings. So if it's 10 different parcels, you can have 10 different easements, which creates those subdivisions. You just, again, sort of have to do that. They'll all be under that. Now, with funded programs, the catch there is you're likely increasing the cost, because now you're talking about 10 closings as opposed to one closing. And so sometimes funding can be an issue, but it can be workable.
I was gonna, yes, the preference, no, please, thank you, because I didn't have it worded as well in my mind as you just spoke it. You know, I mentioned older easements because Department of Agriculture, US and NC Department of Agriculture, back in the late nineties and early 2000s, they were more lenient to allow that sort of thing, and now they're all going together, and the conservation community follows in step. It's basically, if you want to do that, let's make them 10 different conservation easements and not just one.
Is that something you would put through it as one application and one process, or?
Possibly. It really depends. It really depends. I do have a situation right now where the answer is no. I'd actually do 2 separate applications, and basically 2 separate applications under the current landowner's name with different parcel numbers. Or one application with several parcel numbers.
So when you're talking about funding, that's part of the strategy, because sometimes you can pull in weaker parcels, let's say less soils, prime soils, to a stronger one to get it kind of in there. But yeah, it's sort of part of the strategy and just part of what your plan is with your family.
I think you used an example earlier where you were having to knit back 2 properties so that the easement could cross.
Yep, we've had a few situations, but one that just closed in March, that was the landowner had purchased back land that his father had originally owned and wanted to recombine it. And I had made it clear that actually that would be much more preferred by the county to place an easement across 1 parcel as opposed to across 2 separate parcels. And that was a donation situation, so we could have done it either or way. But the landowner's goal was, no, this was my dad's farm, and I wanted to be dad's farm again. And I said, well, it's your farm now, you know. So and it'll be under same name, but yes.
Well, that was all I had, unless there were any other questions. So, thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.